Hello, Costas. Hello, Mateus, how are you?
Hi, Tabwe.
Hello.
No puedo iniciar. Hola, Tabue, ¿cómo estás? No puedo iniciar.
Hola, María Elisa, ¿qué pasa?
Solo que no puedo iniciar mi video porque ustedes lo tienen cerrado. No sé si es normal, pero...
Espera.
Ahora sí, ya me dieron permiso.
Buenos días y buenas tardes. Conectados estamos.
Hola, buenos días.
Hola, hola, buenos días. Buenos días.
Buenos días.
Anna Maria?
Bonjour, Taboué.
Bonjour. Maybe you would like to introduce Maria Elisa to our EPG?
Yes, we can do that maybe after the meeting.
Yeah.
Okay. I see that people are coming in now, so maybe give them one more minute.
Okay. Yeah.
But I see she's there, Maria Elisa. We can say hello.
Yes, hello. Hello, Tabue.
Hello, Maria Elisa, how are you?
Okay, I think everybody is here now, no?
Good morning, everybody hear me?
Yes.
Buenos días, ¿me escuchan? Solo que no veo la cámara también, tengo problemas con la cámara.
Hola, buenos días.
Okay, shall we start? Gabriela?
Okay.
Yes, okay, vamos a empezar.
Let's begin.
Buenos días desde la sede de la Unesco en París.
Good morning or good day to everyone from the UNESCO headquarters, and welcome to this fourth meeting for the series of regional expert consultations against racism and discriminations. My name is Anna Maria Malov, and I'm the chief at the moment of the Inclusion and Rights section. I would like to remind you that you've got interpreting into both Spanish and English in this meeting, and you can choose the language that you want by clicking on the globe at the bottom of your screen.
Spanish interpretation is available during this online meeting, and you can choose the language by clicking on the globe on your screen. Nos gustaría comenzar presentándoles.
We'd like to begin by giving you or by sharing with you a special video clip published by UNESCO, which sends to the whole world a message that we must be united against racism. This video is available on UNESCO's YouTube channel, as well as on other social networks. So go ahead, please.
Many of us like to think of racism as something from the past, something that no longer holds sway over our societies, something that no longer exists.
But World War II took place less than a century ago. Survivors of the Holocaust are still alive today.
The Jim Crow's laws were enforced until 1965.
L'apartheid a été une réalité jusqu'en 1991.
We live in a world where people face barriers to education, employment, health, justice, and culture just because of the color of their skin.
where people are discriminated against, excluded, stigmatized, attacked, or even murdered.
Just because of where they come from, what they look like, or what they believe in.
No more.
No more.
No more.
Hoy decimos basta.
El racismo y la discriminación son causados por la ignorancia y el miedo a lo que creemos diferente.
ويخترقان هياكلنا الإدارية وثقافتنا الشعبية وتحيزنا وفرضياتنا اللاواعية.
But this doesn't have to be the case.
You, me, us, we can create the change that we want.
By defending quality education for all, we can combat the root causes of deadly stereotypes and prejudices.
By developing historical knowledge and critical thinking, we can improve our understanding of the past.
By encouraging cultural diversity, especially at the local level, we can build societies that are more respectful of others.
By empowering the younger generation,
we can help them shape the world to come.
So, stop watching from the sideline.
Read, observe, learn, and listen.
We must hold ourselves accountable.
We must hold our societies accountable.
We are all one humanity.
Keep quiet is not an option.
Is not an option.
Di lo que piensas.
Speak up.
Speak up. Take action.
Take action.
Take action.
Muchas gracias, Jad.
Thank you very much for that, Rod. And now I've got the great pleasure to be able to introduce Gabriela Ramos, the Assistant Director General for Social and Human Sciences, to you, who will be delivering the opening remarks. Go ahead, please, Ms. Ramos. Thank you very much. So there's not really very much for me to say after this very powerful video that we've just seen with a very clear message. With a lot of people who are leaders talking about this issue, and I'm very happy to be here with the leaders of the region as well. To be here together with Maria Lisa, Miriam, Cindy's, Cartena, Meros, and of course, with our teams of Ana Maria, Abuela, and everyone else who's been supporting us in this work we've been doing, in engaging in consultation, in trying to have exchanges, and above all, to try to identify what we need to do to take the steps that are recommended to us in UNESCO, and especially in the sector that I have the pleasure of leading as well. We've initiated this series of regional consultations with experts on racism and discrimination, and there's an interest amongst member states to bring up the level of discussion, but also the action carried out by UNESCO around this area. And this is the fourth time that we're carrying out this series of consultations, and it's a great pleasure for me to be able to do it this time in Spanish. We all know that the fight against racism and discrimination is one of the most important mandates that UNESCO has had since its creation. We've had contributions such as the report by Claude Lévi-Strauss that came out in the 50s on race, in which they showed quite clearly that there was no racial superiority. And they talked about the pseudo-scientific nature of the theories that tried to classify people on racial terms. And then afterwards, we have, of course, the UNESCO Declaration on Race and Racial Prejudice from 1978. And then there's our own programs and activities, such as the Slave Root Project, the General History of Africa, the work carried out by the International Coalition of Inclusive and Sustainable Cities, and the recently started master classes against racism and discrimination, which Ana Maria has been introducing in many regions. So one important aspect of this discussion is the work that we're doing on artificial intelligence and recommendations on the ethics associated with that focus on AI. But of course, we're also worrying about a bias that might exist that can affect significant parts of our population, which normally have not been able to participate in these major technological developments. We also know that the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated the pre-existing inequalities, and that's no surprise that the people who were most vulnerable have found their situation worsened. Those who, for example, don't have the economic, or those who have economic leveraging or education or access to technology are those people who've been able to deal with the pandemic in a way that's much less painful than for many other people, for those who are marginalized. And once this pandemic is over, which we don't know when that's going to be, but we hope that it's soon, we're going to find ourselves facing an even greater crisis affecting those groups that have always been marginalized. New research, as well as international UNESCO seminars on inclusion in the times of COVID-19, have pointed out an increase in vulnerability of specific groups in Latin America and the Caribbean as well. These groups, and this won't surprise us, because that's who we've invited to be here with us as well, are women and children, women and girls, especially when we talk about violence, indigenous people, people of African descent, and migrants. Indigenous people, as we know, have always been facing a series of obstacles, from lessened access to medical services and education to a lack of appropriate or insufficient information in indigenous languages, including job and food insecurity. People of African descent are also negatively affected by the coronavirus due to or they are being affected and have been due to the nature of the work that they carry out, their housing conditions, as well as difficulties as well in having access to healthcare services. Migrants, which work in the mostly in the informal sector, which is the most affected by the pandemic, so restaurants, hotels, the retail sector, services, etc., find themselves without work, without income, since the majority of them, of course, don't receive state subsidies. And migrants as well are victims of the xenophobia of local communities, since they are often considered to be a danger to their health. Aside from these obstacles, we've talked about the issue of women and girls, which are overrepresented in terms of those who are affected by health, but they're also the ones who fight in the pandemic. They're the nurses, those who are working in the healthcare service at its very base. And they're also there in the education system. They're the people who are considered essential workers, essential and yet not well paid, not well protected, that have been struck most hard by this pandemic. And of course, that these lockdown measures, as well as we know, have dramatically increased the amount of violence carried out against women as well. And that's been worsened because of this lockdown, 30 to 40% to 15% increase in the amount of domestic violence. It's just absolutely inhuman that such an increase has happened. The source of the major exposure to the effects of this has been, of course, the inequality that existed already. And the figures that we've got from before COVID are quite convincing. Prevalence of poverty amongst the people of African descent and indigenous people is inversely proportional to their proportion in the population of the region. 43% of indigenous people of Latin America are poor, according to the World Bank, and 24% are extremely poor. People of African descent also make up half of those who are living in extreme poverty and have 2.5 greater chance of being chronically poor. And when we talk about poverty, it's not only a question of money, but it's also these different advantages, lack of access to high-quality education, to healthcare, to be finding yourself in lockdown in communities that don't have good infrastructures, that don't have the same digital access that others might, that are suffering from unemployment or underemployment as already. So this is an issue of an accumulation of a whole series of disadvantages. According to the International Organization for Migration in the region of America, Latin, and the Caribbean, the South-South movements have increased in the last few years. Even before the pandemic, internal migrants of the region were stigmatized by the hosting communities. So our own countries, discriminating against immigrants from other southern countries. So I'm Mexican as well. So this is something that makes me extremely distressed and something that we have to eliminate. It's something that has to do with fear that the host communities or local communities have of losing their jobs. But this can cause crime and abuse as well. In terms of gender violence, Latin America is showing the highest rates in the world before the outbreak of COVID-19. Women and girls have much greater possibilities than men to be in the groups of those who are affected by poverty or extreme poverty. If a family has problem and doesn't continue to be able to send their children to school, then it's the girls who are sacrificed first. This puts them on the front line of later on having unstable work, a whole series of having lower income in the future, not being able to reach positions of leadership at all. And thus the circle continues. So this pandemic is showing that in Latin American and Caribbean, that ethnicity, race, social class, and gender are inextricably connected, and that they're constantly overlapping different ways, creating these dynamic feedback loops that maintain a complex structure of social inequality and discrimination. In order to identify, understand, and face these inequalities, data is extremely important. And that's why, especially in the current context, it's important that we have data that has been glossed apart, that gives us the elements that we need to be able to base our decisions on. That's why we'll be focusing our efforts using that data to fight against discrimination and racism, not only to understand racism better, but to understand the mechanisms by which discrimination occurs in all of its ways. And also to what extent, or what is the reach of and the efficiency of the legal networks that exist, and in what way laws themselves might in fact be contributing towards discrimination or institutions. So this is one of the things that we want to talk about with you. And after this series of consultations, what we would like to be able to do is to bring together all the different expertise and know-how that you've got to be able to offer a proposal, a solid proposal about what UNESCO is going to be doing to try to shore up or strengthen its contribution in its fight towards these things that are so negatively impacting humanity. So thank you very much for being with us today. We're glad to have the experts here for this debate, and we do very much hope that this can contribute towards this goal that we've got. Thank you to all of you, and it's a great pleasure for me to be here with you. So let's move directly on to the panel. Ana Maria, isn't that right?
Jembel.
Hola, ¿qué tal? ¿Me escucho bien?
Hi, can you hear me okay? Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Jebel Chifundo. It's a great pleasure to be here with you today, and it's my pleasure to moderate today's session, which is the fourth edition of a series of 6 regional consultations aimed to deconstruct racism and unpack the societal challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic as related to racism and discrimination, and to give actionable recommendations to guide UNESCO's work together with its partners. Since the beginning of the pandemic, we have been witness to numerous reports in the media about racially motivated acts and violence, including hate speech against populations who are discriminated against due to their skin, color, ethnic origin, and religious beliefs. The COVID-19 crisis paved the way for scapegoating, brought to the fore far-right movements, or provided the excuse for far-reaching and disproportionate restrictions to the enjoyment of human rights. Viruses such as Black Lives Matter and I Am Not a Virus have created a resounding impact in various contents of the world, exposing previously existing prejudice and discrimination that had continued to plague our societies. At the present conjuncture, the reawakening of the moral conscious and the increased global protests in different cities around the world have rekindled age-old racial wounds and further unveiled the disproportionate inequalities and injustice that these affected populations have endured. As the series aims at providing an in-depth contextual analysis through a regional perspective, this edition will focus on Latin America and the Caribbean. We have a distinguished panel of speakers who have generously accepted to join us today for this consultation. So I would like to present who our distinguished speakers for today are. We've got José Francisco Calaitze, UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous People of the UN from Guatemala. We've got Ana Maria Velázquez Gutierrez, who's a researcher on sociologist, anthropologist researcher, professor of author on history and culture of Mexican people of African descent in Mexico. Miriam Elizabeth Suarez Garcia is the executive coordinator of the Ethno-Racial Equality and Migrant Population Secretariat at the municipality of Montevideo, Uruguay. We've also got Carla Moore, who's an artist, an activist, and academic in Jamaica. Cindy Mesa, who's the program officer of the Andean Region Ford Foundation offices. Mateus Gato de Jesus, professor, Department of Sociology at the University of Campinas in Brazil. We've got also Rina Cáceres, who's a member of the International Scientific Committee of the Slave Route Project in Costa Rica. So we've got a marvelous group of speakers, and we're very grateful for them being with us today.
Let me now explain which the format of a discussion will be. The idea is to encourage an interactive and dynamic discussion with the speakers. So I'm going to put questions and give you time to answer. I will ask speakers to comment or react to intervention, and this discussion panel will last 60 minutes, and then I'll ask the audience to raise questions through the Q&A box located on the bottom of the screen. Such consultations will then lead to a number of recommendations which UNESCO will take up. And towards the end of this discussion, I'll ask every one of the speakers to formulate 2 or 3 very concrete recommendations. So I'll start with a set of questions which we have prepared for you. Dear speakers, during the discussion, I will ask you more concrete questions so that you can elaborate on your thinking. In this first round, please be brief. Allot 3 minutes to each of you to answer these questions. Let me remind you that the audience can ask questions using the Q&A box. So as to set the framework for our debate, I will put 2 questions to all of you. They are in fact interconnected. In your opinion, how has racism evolved up to the current COVID-19 context? And which intersectional discriminations are emerging and re-emerging during this crisis? And to what extent does racial discrimination, which is gender-based, coincide with this? Mrs. Cindy Mesa, you have 3 minutes to answer these 2 questions. Thank you. To start, let me tell you that I'm going to base myself on a structure to see how to measure racism. Tabican Williams has structured this. He classifies racism into 3 types: structural, institutionalized, and everyday racism. Structural racism, that is the systemic location in low-paid jobs at the lower scale, a low part of the scale, and that's how racism was built up in territories that led to death through the centuries. For example, in Colombia, the Pacific region and the armed conflict in Colombia took place, in fact, in territories which were where Black communities were living. And as regards institutional racism, well, the bad access to healthcare, to education, and to basic services, that shows the disproportionate impact of racism and the way it affects indigenous populations and people of African descent. The evolution has more to do with the narrative itself. In fact, this is becoming clear, and we see it through a number of different aspects. Certain people are not treated as politely as others, or even in a pejorative way in public places like restaurants, shops. People of African descent are too shy to talk to you normally, or have doubts whether they are in fact up to certain tasks. And now we come to the pandemic of COVID-19. This is a specific challenge for the world as a whole. And this pandemic showed how fragile and vulnerable our political and economic system is when it comes to face the reality of indigenous populations and populations of African descent. If the states don't take into account the specific realities of these population groups, then the risk is that conditions will only worsen. The impact of COVID on these minority groups is becoming clear. And during the crisis, we also became aware of inequalities between ethnic groups that can lead to discrimination in the healthcare system. But the effects of the pandemic is not limited to healthcare. It goes from free movement to access to education, to access to information, up to a dignified way of living. And for the ethnic groups, there's one basic right which is at stake, the right to live and to enjoy proper subsistence levels. It could also be a danger of extinction for these communities. Therefore, we have to understand the situation of these ethnic communities in the framework of the present pandemic, and that's essential to see what's at stake, the actual existence and survival of these communities. And to give you some concrete example how disproportionate this impact is in the indigenous regions, mining, forestry, agriculture is going on. And then the rights are not really upheld, and so there is an increased risk that people from outside could come to these communities. They could be infected already. And in part of the Amazonas, certain indigenous communities have a much higher risk to contract COVID-19. And some decisions of the governments and the industry are also a pressure for investment, and that could endanger the collective rights and the environmental standards for these communities, and also the territorial rights of these indigenous communities who are entitled to be previously consulted and well informed. And in the case of Colombia, there were murders and attacks against social leaders of indigenous populations and populations of African descent because they defend their land and their environment. There is an intersectional problem there, physical violence against women and gender violence, which has in fact increased because the measures of quarantine to react to the pandemic particularly when we're talking about minority groups, are simply not the ones that are most apt to be applied here. That's what I wanted to say for the moment. Thank you, Cindy, for this contribution, and I would like to give the floor to Maria Elisa Velasquez Gutierrez, who has another 3 minutes for her intervention. Thank you, Jimbo. It's a pleasure to take part in this UNESCO panel. Thank you to Tawe, Gabriela, and Maria, and to the International Project of the Slave Road, which I've been presiding for a number of years. A great honor to me. Of course, this crisis, we say it again and again, has affected Latin America in a way that racism and discrimination, which were a reality for years, have become much more clear than before. And we've also seen that there are no public policies, institutional policies, which could try and close these economic gaps. Quite to the contrary. So COVID-19 showed that those communities which were living in poverty and which were marginalized already are now even in deeper poverty and marginalization. Gabriela and Cindy have said it already. This is connected with the problem of women. Women are not protected at home from this pandemic. Quite on the contrary, they have suffered more domestic violence. In the case of Mexico, this has become quite clear. There's evidence for it. And we also see it in communities of African descent. I mostly work with these communities of African descent. They exist in Mexico. The Constitution has only recognized this fact last year. It was a fact that had been denied forever, for decades and centuries. The people of African descent were not being considered at all in Mexico. When I was chairing the Slave Road Project, UNESCO asked me, why would Mexico be in that project if there were no Black people in Mexico? Well, this is not so. There are 1,400,000 people in Mexico who define themselves as people of African descent. And since the problems have become evidenced, let me just give you two examples for racist problems in Mexico in the context of communities of African descent. For once, healthcare. A big deficit in healthcare. There is a good part of this population living in Territorial Oaxaca on the coast, and there's practically no health infrastructure. To get to a hospital, you have to hit the road for 8 hours. In any case, to get to Acapulco, Oaxaca, which are the big cities which are closest by. So in fact, people have no access to a hospital, which is what they would need if they notice they may have COVID, for example. This shows the racist problems of the country. For once, these population groups are denied, and then there is no institutionally based policy and the everyday racism that affects them as well. And then Gabriela was talking about the migrations that arrived from the south of Mexico, from Capachula, for example. There were, in fact, problems. These migrants from Central America had obstacles to accede, and even African groups. There were Africans from 34 different countries coming to the border at Capachula, and there they were discriminated against and racism became clear, and the Mexican state has not really publicly admitted this. And as Gabriela said, the problems of racism become clear at an institutional level, but in the society itself as well. With this crisis of the pandemic, we also see the fear from others arriving, the lack of knowledge of the presence of other communities and groups through history. And this led to clear racism against these communities. Jembel, I think I'll get more time, right, to talk later on about the intersectional problems concerning women. Thank you, Maria. That was brilliant. And now we give the floor to Jose Francisco Calizay. 3 minutes. We can't hear you. Could you please switch on your microphone or unmute it? Yes, good morning. Thank you. My name is Jose Francisco Calizay. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. And I thank Unesco for the invitation to this regional seminar to talk about indigenous people and the development of racism in these times of COVID-19. As Maria Elisa said, we are probably going to repeat ourselves when talking about this subject, particularly when it comes to discrimination and racial discrimination against indigenous people that is structurally based and becomes evident in different ways. One of the most obvious ways where we can see it is that there's no access to the healthcare system, and also the lack of truthful and clear information about what COVID-19 really is, not only in the official language of the country, but it should also be formulated in the indigenous languages. That is very important. Then I would like to point out that indigenous people who have an existence in international agreements and in regional agreements, United Nations and OAS, is not really enough or sufficiently recognized. In these difficult times, the rights of the indigenous people there and their leaders should be more strongly defended in the Americas. And the indigenous population does not really have access to its own land. There's a lot of talk about the relaunching of the economy, which is very necessary. Excuse me if I'm not too diplomatic, but in fact, they are disregarding human rights of indigenous people as they are only talking about economic development. And the previous consultation of the indigenous population is not being carried out, nor is the environmental impact taken into account sufficiently. Only women, mostly women, are suffering from the consequences of COVID-19. what quarantine did to the indigenous communities led to an increase of domestic violence within the family. And in fact, there's much more rape during quarantine, and that is very serious. A report on COVID-19 and its impact on indigenous populations has been put to the General Assembly, and there we say that xenophobia is also on the increase. Women suffer most of all this because they continue dressing in traditional clothing of the indigenous population, and they're very proud of it. And when they go to bigger cities, it does happen quite often that they're being insulted, spit on, and they're being told that they are infectious with COVID. This is happening right now. As we were thinking that humanity was making headway, because it's now about 50 years that we're talking about the fight of discrimination and racism in the region. Then there is limited access to justice. At present, for indigenous communities, when they're being accused, justice is immediate. But when they suffer, justice looks the other way and doesn't advance at all, or very, very slowly indeed. So they don't enjoy justice.
I believe what COVID made was to lift the veil of this reality, and now it is uncovering a reality, the truth, the actual reality that indigenous peoples are living in a daily basis, experiencing a neglect of their basic needs. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Zai. Obviously, COVID-19 has uncovered the many discrimination forms that have that many groups, people of African descent, indigenous people, have suffered for a long time. Now, I'll give the floor to Mateus Gato de Jesus. You have 3 minutes.
And the point for me, and I agree with the others' presentations, is that the new normal has color. The COVID-19 pandemic has intensified the class and gender cleavage, and we can see this by noting who can work at home and or not. In Brazil, 72% of people who are in home office hold a higher degree. And in this group, whites are twice as many as black. And in the situation of the pandemic, whites are twice as likely to get jobs as black now because of that. And when we look to another point in the job market, in the informal sector, blacks represented about 70% of works, and they had most of their jobs broken up in April. The black population is the one that depends most exclusively on the unified health system, and the one that represents the majority of patients with diabetes, tuberculosis, hypertension. This is considered aggravating by COVID-19. Added to this, in another striking aspect, inequalities in the distribution of public services, such as water and the basic sanitation, urban mobility, and the access to hospital, which reveals the importance of a territorial dimension. There is less record of Black people with the COVID-19, but a greater number of deaths among this population. So this is the data from Brazil. And COVID-19 also in Brazil shows the categories that were still inside, delighted and deprived of access to minimum research, quilombolas, and indigenous people who live the drama of struggle for the recognition of their territories face the absence of policies under underreporting of cases to powerful forms of erasure. The prison population and the homeless population, as they have no visibility in the eyes of the social policies of the Brazilian state, remain silent and pass the moral judgment of who deserves to be cared for and who deserves to live at this moment. And Brazil have now a big situation in a political terms. We have now a government which don't recognize the social movements as an important part for the construction of democracy. So for me, this is the big picture of how the pandemic situation intensifying the dynamics of class and race in Brazil. That's it.
Muchísimas gracias, Mateo, por tu valioso aporte.
Thank you very much, Mateus, for your participation. I have the pleasure to give the floor now to Madam Miriam Elizabeth Suarez Garcia, another professor. Good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure for me to participate in this consultation. I define myself as an activist, feminist, and fighting against racism, and I believe it's important to use it as a first description when I introduce myself. Of course, I agree with the majority of what my colleagues have said. And regarding this perception of the COVID-19 as a phenomenon that has reinforced the structural racism, and it underscores the structural, historic inequality of many minorities. People of African descent, for example, and migrant people, that is another group that we work with from my office. There are many, many issues that we have touched upon today, starting from the definition of racism and how the different definitions of racism have evolved, adapting to the vulnerability of the different groups of population. In Uruguay, we say that there are three forms of racism related to legal racism, denied racism, and the structural racism, or the usual or current or common racism. I'll try to avoid repeating myself with other ideas that were already mentioned. So I'd like to move on now to, and I'm trying to review the question. I'd like to mention how, in the case of women, racism is being exacerbated. And of course, the lockdown, what it shows is the vulnerability of women regarding domestic violence and gender violence, something that from a statistic point of view, we many times we said this is not a casual thing. It has a discriminatory component. And on the other hand, I believe that the main issue here, apart from access to health, and luckily for us, Uruguay is not one of the countries suffering greater from the COVID pandemic, but actually it has been quite well managed and controlled with the lockdown that took place in the first weeks. But basically what we understand as a vulnerability is related to the work market or job system. And as someone mentioned before, the informal sector, that is also very, is preponderantly a female market, and how this is related to management, different kind of enterprises or businesses, and also everything related to the domestic workers. There, you can also see many ways of discrimination, specifically when we're talking about migrant women. Many claims have been put to criticize the situation they live through the pandemics. There was this idea that people had to preserve their jobs and keep on working, even through the pandemic and the lockdown and everything. This is putting the light on the vulnerability of our societies. Another topic that was mentioned and that we work on as a reply, one of the first replies to the COVID situation was teleworking, and we realized that it was not always a solution. Of course, it can provide some continuity to work, and it depends on the location of the workers, or well, also the education sector, the digital divide that is very prevalent in our societies and populations. It's also another way of discrimination, because of course we understand that it was a way of giving a solution to the pandemic, but it's not taking into account the different difficulties that groups of population may have. And there are some reactionary discourses and approaches, very, very tough, not only related to discrimination and racism, but also on the sexual diversity, and not to mention xenophobia, that has been underscored in this context of scarcity of jobs. But many times, migrant populations are being shamed on, are being put the blame on. And what about women, working women, single moms? We are facing high numbers of these cases in public institutions. In Montevideo, we try to counter this situation and to help face the housing crisis and the food crisis. But we saw that there were high numbers in these population groups, and mainly women. On the other hand, I believe that inequality has to be tackled with a holistic approach, and also mainly the poverty in children, with a social structure that involves the whole society, improving education, training. And maybe I'm going too far in this answer because I'm going beyond the question, but I believe everything has to be taken into account. We need a whole set of improvements from the national governments, local governments, with programmatic approaches, taking into account the needs of the population, and also having this intersectional idea. We cannot separate who we are, if we're women, African, people of African descent, migrants. It doesn't matter. If there is an oppression system, there is a higher vulnerability of these groups. The quality of lives of these groups is really, really being hit. And I will stop here because otherwise I could be here speaking forever, and I'll be repeating what others have already said. It's a pleasure for me to be here. Thank you very much, Madam Garcia. I'll give the floor now to Madam Carla Moore. I'd like to know, what do you think about these different ideas that have been put on the table?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jambel. Thank you to UNESCO for having me. And also, I'm really happy to be in the presence of everybody that's here today. I will be speaking about, sometimes it's difficult to have a discussion about racism when you're talking about a country that's majority Black and has a very small non-Black population. Case in point, Jamaica. Jamaicans will happily tell you that, oh, we don't have a race problem, we have a class problem. We don't have a race problem, we have a class problem. But when you look at it, our class problem is actually a race problem. it is a race-based class problem that we have, right? So what you'll find happening is colorism, featureism, and that type of stuff. But also what I suggest is that our classism is based in racism. So prior to COVID-19, some of the things that you would notice in Jamaica and in some other Caribbean countries is a centering of whiteness, right? So outside of anti-Blackness, what you get is a centering of whiteness. Whiteness and Europeanness is at the center of how we understand what is beautiful, what is decent, what is worthwhile, what an educated person looks like, what a person who is of value looks like, what is worthy of public representation. You see that showing up, for instance, in who we choose to, and this may seem minuscule, but it's actually indicative of the larger problem. Who do we send forward to compete for like Miss World and Miss Universe? It's gonna be the light-skinned, almost white-looking person with the hair that goes like this, right? And we send them forward and they win. So it's strategic for us, but it's also foolishness because the rest of the population doesn't look like that. It comes up in advertising. One of the ways that anti-Blackness comes up in Jamaica is the fact that our mother tongue is Patois, Jamaican Patois. It's our indigenous language, and people are still struggling with the idea of it. They don't want it taught in school. They call it slave language. You know, some people call it slave language, and they don't want their children to speak it because it's an indication that you're not educated or smart enough. Your ability to speak English is the thing that marks you as smart. Skin lightening or skin bleaching is still quite prevalent. It's actually picked up a bit because people either want to be light skin, black, or as close to white as they possibly can. They also recognize that having lighter skin gives you certain advantages, and so they want to lighten their skin, right? The other thing that we have to deal with in Jamaica is anti-Blackness as practiced by Black people on other Black people. This also is racism in action. So for example, the way that we police each other through Black respectability. One of the things that we see coming up is Rastafari. I don't know if everybody here is, you know about Rastafari? It's a livity or a religion that came up in Jamaica. They wear dreadlocks, right? So we still have a problem with Rastafari, where recently a judgment was made that said it was okay for a school to refuse a student to come in because they had locks. So schools are still being allowed to tell people you can't be educated here because you have dreadlocks. We are the country that created Rastafari, and we're still struggling with this. Why? Because it's not European. It's thought of as an African construct, and not just that, it comes from low-income Black people. Race and class are imbricated, right? The other thing that we do with racism is we punish people who are not able or willing to perform Black respectability. For instance, I think most of the world knows about the idea that Jamaica is the most homophobic place on earth, right? Times wrote us up in 2006. We haven't managed to live it down yet. A part of that actually comes back to Black respectability. Being gender non-conforming is not considered respectable inside of this politics of Black respectability. And so it shows up in homophobia, it shows up in transphobia, it shows up in biphobia, right? Women who are sexually liberal are not considered as conforming to the politics of Black respectability. As a result, dancehall music defines Jamaica on the world stage, but it's still contested inside of the country because the women in dancehall are too sexually liberal. Race-based thinking. Again, men who are emotional, not Black responsible. You need to be tough like a rock stone if you're a man, right? If you're not being as tough as a rock stone, it's not respectable. We don't like it. The other thing that we have to think about is how race becomes a stand-in for class. One of the questions that I always ask in Jamaica is, oh, well, you know, if we are a country that doesn't have a problem with race, where are the white people living in the ghetto? Where are they? If we actually don't have a race problem, then there should be as many white people living in the ghetto as we have living in the high income areas, but you will rarely find a white Jamaican living in a low income area because we actually do have a race problem, and it shows up in that way, right? The other things that come up in terms pre-COVID, in terms of race in Jamaica, is Black liberation as anti-LGBT sentiment, Black nationalism as anti-LGBT sentiment, wherein LGBT is considered a thing that was brought to us by Europeans, by white people, and Jamaicans have decided, some, not all, not the majority actually, have decided that they're going to define themselves as sovereign by not accepting this external construct. And I'll say more on that later. Black masculine liberation as patriarchy. So Black men have to be extra masculine, hyper masculine, and patriarchal as a way of liberating themselves, right? The other thing is that the indigenous population doesn't get much space at all. The story that we were told actually is that all the indigenous people in Jamaica were killed. So there are people in Jamaica right now who don't actually know that indigenous Tainos still exist. Yes, there's anti-Asian sentiment that comes up, in particular with relationships with like wholesalers. We have a lot of Asian people working as wholesalers. You know, issues between Indian and African people, in particular, if you look like in Trinidad, where it's almost 50-50 split, there's still racial tension, despite the fact that people of both races have been living in the country for years. And the last thing that I would say is a lack of self-esteem. It is actually, when I look at it, and in particular as an educator, when I look at my students, I can look at the skin tone of my student, and there is almost a direct correlation between how dark a person's skin is and how low their self-esteem is. And that pays forward in terms of what opportunities they go after, what opportunities they feel like they're worthy of, and their life path. A lot of it is determined by low self-esteem in Black people and higher self-esteem in people who are lighter skinned or white. And I'll end here.
Muchísimas gracias, querida Carla.
Thank you very much. Good morning. It's a real pleasure to be here with you today, to meet some of you, and to say hello to some other colleagues that I know, as Maria Elisa. I agree with many of the opinions expressed. I face four main issues in my daily work. First of all, xenophobia. As others said, it is more acute in indigenous peoples. It's one of the biggest problems in the country because we have two sectors regarding people of African descent. Urban areas, on the one hand, and those people have, have access to political culture. Actually, we have some elected charges of people coming from that group. But on the other hand, we have people living in the coastal area. And here we face a second issue that is not that much xenophobia, but social and economic exclusion. We have a very, very vulnerable groups regarding access to jobs, access to goods and services, and it's quite concerning in the face of the post-COVID era, because those populations that were already vulnerable, and I'm talking about 20 years of backlog here. Well, now they're going to face a very complicated situation after the COVID pandemic. Another issue that concerns me, and this is related to the youth and is related to structural issues, as you mentioned,
is that young people, or it's not only that they're not taken care of by public policies, as Maria Elisa said, this lack of public policy towards those communities, but that our young people don't actually know what their rights are to be able to ask for them. And so that think that it's absolutely essential that we're able to offer them support and those people who are civil society leaders in making sure that they can offer those opportunities to the young people. And so I think xenophobia, economic inequality, and the public policies and the legal use or the assertive demand thereof, that those three factors have to be taken into account, and all have to do with what Carla has mentioned, which is the whitening of whiteness, or ideological racism, which is actually behind the answers that are actually given to these premises. Along these lines, or in that respect, I think that a lot of this type of racism is structural in nature, and there is an underlying narrative which is built in the formal structure of education, both in the public schools as well as in the private schools, be that primary or secondary education. And that's where the young people, be they indigenous or of African descent, are finding themselves faced with a daily experience The question is not so much how many of their contributions are actually analyzed that are given from them. There's probably not very many. And those contributions that are made by their population are probably expressed in a folkloric type of way. If we talk about the indigenous population, they're expressed more in a folkloric way rather than their actual participation. With the people of African descent, it's impressive that the only reference you can actually say to them is the reference that's made to the period of slavery. But not only, but it's not analyzed in terms of its deeper consequences. It's just a historical reading of slavery in a derogatory way, which perpetuates logic of subordination, which is what the text or in class, that's what's actually taught. So in school, and when faced with the silence about the contributions made by people of African descent and the contribution of indigenous people as well, and a silence around their fight for freedom as well. When faced with that, it can be very difficult for those children, for those young people, to actually rise up to the challenge and face that message, to actually have ways to offer a counter-argument to everything they're taught. And that's not a coincidence. We've seen this in the entire Central American region when we asked people about their opinion about what their communities had about the people of African descent, indigenous communities. What came from all of the different communities in all the countries at the region was the humiliation of having been a slave. But let us not lose time necessarily about the different adjectives as well that came from those surveys. And I think aside from the seriousness of COVID, what COVID has also done is to give a new way of functioning, a new life to the structural racism, which in our case affects indigenous people as well as people of African descent. And I think we have various challenges, one of which is to speak about a new way of teaching and a new way of literacy that includes everyone equally. We have to be able to make sure that our classes are livable, that the texts are more livable so that young people can acquire under equality conditions the tools that they need to be able to fight against economic inequality that they've inherited from society. And maybe I'll leave it there for right now. Thank you very much to all the panelists for their contributions, their valuable contribution. I think everyone agrees in that what we've seen from the pandemic is that it's aggravated the forms of discrimination and the racism that the different indigenous people and people of African descent have been facing throughout history. It's quite clear that all the stereotypes that affect people as indigenous or as of African descent mean that these different forms of exclusion are worsened, and especially if we think about the intersectionality of being a woman, young, a mother, and a person of African descendant, well, it means that you have a different experience. Being the pandemic with the body of a woman of African descent who's a mother, and being another person not the same. And you've talked about this. You brought this all onto the table, and these are issues that we need to work on the creation of public policies that take into account this ethnic perspective to work against the inequality that we people of African descent, indigenous peoples are fighting with and that are worsened under crisis. So to continue this debate that we're having, I would like to ask specific questions to each one of our different panelists based on their particular knowledge and experience. And to make sure that we're not repeating what's been said before, I would like to encourage a debate here, and that if you want to actually react to something that you heard from one of the people who's spoken previously, you may go ahead and do so. So let's begin with Mr. Jose Francisco Calizay. I'm sorry for not having said your name correctly the first time. And the first question that I've got for you, sir, would be, since March of 2020, you are the new Special UN Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. What are your priorities in the current context? Thank you very much for your question. Last week, In my report to the Council of Human Rights, I brought up various priorities within my rapporteurship, one of which is not only to raise awareness around, but to monitor the abiding by or fulfilling of the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples of the United Nations. That's one of the specific mandates or it's an exclusive mandate, the one that needs to be dealt with. Another priority, basically, is the situation of indigenous peoples in urban contexts. Many sociologists believe that indigenous people only live in rural areas. Often, there are many countries, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, United States, Chile, even my own country of Guatemala, where the majority of the population live in urban areas. So this leads to a situation of greater poverty and greater racism and racial stigmatization. And this is one of the areas that I also want to work on as part of my mandate. The situation of those who fight for the rights of indigenous peoples, for the defenders of indigenous peoples' rights, is another situation which is quite worrying, because we're seeing even more attacks on those people who fight for or defend the rights of indigenous people currently. The issues about ownership that have to do with ownership of the land that belongs to indigenous people is something else that's quite concerning, as is, of course, the monitoring of the impact of COVID-19 on the indigenous people. This is something that my rapporteurship will also be concerned about. Those who came before me in the position, we might say, they weren't able to make enough official visits to African and Asian countries, and that's something that I would like to change and ask Asian and African countries as well to authorize official visits to their territory. But of course, this in no way means that I would be forgetting the Latin American region. I am a part of this American continent, and I will continue to be so. Focusing my gaze on the situation of indigenous peoples of the American continent. Beyond this, we also have the mandate, which is quite clear, which is the mandate of coordination between the bodies that are based on treaty and special organizations. So I think that this gives us a great opportunity at this very moment to work on coordination and the strengthening of that coordination between the treaty bodies and the mechanisms that exist for human rights defense. So that would perhaps be my answers to what would be my priorities for the next 2 years. Mr. Kali, before being nominated to this post, you were a member of the Committee for the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. How can this mechanism lead to change on the field? Well, unfortunately, as we all know, the Committee for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination was the first, well, what do we call it? Body adopted by the UN. Sometimes people think that it's a Committee of Human Rights, and that could make a mistake. It's not true. The first body was actually the Committee for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. That was the first body created by the UN in '65. But at that moment, it wasn't given what other committees have. What's that called? The name of the, I've forgotten it now, of that mechanism. The one that is in charge of actually monitoring and following that up, actually to make sure that the states are implementing the recommendations and enacting the final conclusions of the debates that were carried out between the committee on the one hand and the member states on the other. And that's something that's missing. 2 African countries have tried to set up or implement this mechanism so that the committee would have political power and to able to oblige states to fulfill the recommendations or comply with the recommendations that come from the committee. There is another issue, which is that the committee in its mandate doesn't have necessarily the right to make visits to states. There are other committees that do have those mandates, but the Committee for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination does not have a mandate for making field visits. For this, we would have to make a change within the actual convention, which I don't know if that's something that the states right now are willing to do. Excuse me, I'd forgotten the term before. It was called the optional protocol. That's what's actually needed right now. The committee doesn't have the optional protocol, and that's something that's missing and that should be implemented if possible. But when I was had the chairpersonship of the committee, what we could do is we could make unofficial visits. So they were not official visits, but they nevertheless gave us the opportunity to engage in academic coordination with different universities, be they public or private, to make a visit, a non-official visit to the state, and take advantage of that moment to make sure that those sectors that were suffering from racism or being discriminated against could engage in direct contact with the person there who was engaging in that academic exchange with the university. So these are some mechanisms that could come into place, but there's another issue. There's a need for the people to be familiar with what tools are at their disposal to denounce or to lodge complaints. They can do prior and urgent complaint based on Title or Chapter 9 of the Convention. They can also make complaints by individuals or groups that are based on Article 14, and some 2 years ago when I was in the committee, I had the honor of helping to set up the working group on attacks against defenders of human rights. But I think these are the different mechanisms that need to be better known so that people can actually carry out or lodge those complaints and bring them to the committee. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Jose Francisco Jalitzay. Now I'd like to give the floor to Maria Elisa Velázquez Gutierrez and ask you, Professor, you were the president of the International Scientific Committee of the project, of the Slave Route Project of UNESCO, and are a well-known anthropologist and sociologist that works on the African-Mexican issue. So I'd like to know, taking into account, how and why do you think that UNESCO needs to re-examine the question of racism today, using as a starting point history and the memory of slavery? Thank you for that question. First of all, I would like to greet my colleague, Ms. Rina Cáceres, who's there in the committee still. And I'm very grateful that this committee is being done in Spanish. I didn't say it before, but I'm very happy about that, because in UNESCO, you always have to speak English. And for those of us whose native language is Spanish, that can be difficult sometimes. So thank you very much for giving us the chance to be able to speak Spanish here today. And this was actually something, what you asked was something I wanted to talk about. I think that the Slave Route Project in UNESCO was really a groundbreaking international program or project that spoke about the issue of breaking the silence that exists around the crime of the enslaving of African people, and has talked about how important it is to focus our attention on the contributions made by those populations to our countries. So aside from these different treaties that right now, the treaties that have been signed, or the fact that we're in the decade as well of people of African descent, and if we talk about the budgets that are also given to different issues and the fact that they have been cut in many cases drastically. In our case, the project that we've got to work on this issue in Mexico lost 75% of its budget. We don't have money to do any work with. So these are all things that COVID-19 has caused and that affect the amount of care we can offer, the research we can engage in. But you were asking me about the role of history and memory. It's absolutely basic. People that doesn't have history, that doesn't know what its past is, cannot face the present and certainly not the future. That's why this project is so important, continues to be so important. This project about enslaved persons in UNESCO. And in this respect, I would suggest that we need to offer more follow-up of these projects. UNESCO needs to do more awareness raising about the results of this project. There should be a commission within UNESCO that offers a follow-up of what is actually happening with this decade of people of African descent. This has to do with the recognition, as Sulema said, of justice and development as well. And we need to offer a monitoring or follow-up of the progress made in different countries, and there needs to be annual reports as well. I'm very concerned about the fact that we might have the best of intentions and make all sorts of statements, official statements, but from UNESCO as well, but that they're not really focusing on solutions to these problems. Later on, I'll be offering some solutions that I believe are recommendations, but I think we also need to denaturalize racism and the word race itself. We have to dismantle that word, as Rena was saying, from the sphere of education. We can't continue to educate people via this belief of the existence of races between human groups. This is something that should not be possible anymore in education. Children from a very young age are learning that there are different races. And the problem with making a distinction between races is that some are superior and some are inferior. We can't keep doing it this way. We have to change this way of thinking from the foundation of education. This idealization of whiteness, for example, that we have to destroy those paradigms which are completely absurd and were created in the 18th and 19th century to justify the trade of enslaved persons. We can't continue to offer strength to that way of thinking. So one of my recommendations that I would have concretely for UNESCO would to offer a follow-up of the publications and results of their projects.
It's not enough to proclaim decades or recommend what we should do. We have to ask for reports and then follow them up and ask member states to achieve concrete results in the public policies. Thank you. Thank you, Professor, for your valuable report. And as a second question, everybody talks about intersectionality, but it seems difficult to act concretely starting from this heuristic concept. How do you think UNESCO could launch this and come to action? How can we continue talking about this idea of intersectionality? Well, I think it has become fashionable to talk about it, but in fact, we have had this for decades. Marxism, in fact, launched it. There are a number of historic, economic, gender-based ideological circumstances which further problems of poverty, discrimination, and racism. And so I feel that projects and recommendations of UNESCO to its member states should put the problem into this holistic framework. As someone said, I think it was Carla, arena as well. I think it's not enough to be of African descent of the small coast of Oaxaca, then being of descent of a later migration. And it's not the same to be a man or to be a woman either in this community. That is intersectionality, and it should, in fact, become concrete in projects where these problems and these crossroads of problems become obvious. And then public policy should be developed. And they shouldn't only approach racism as something linear and abstract, which has nothing to do with economics. It's also the result of a lack of knowledge, of ignorance, and of economic inequality. Someone's talking, but we can't hear. Is the microphone on? Yes, now we do hear it. The speaker again. Thank you, Professor. So now we'll come to Miriam Elizabeth Suarez Garcia with the following question. You lead the work of the Montevideo municipality about equality between migrant population groups. Which were your main challenges and which policies and measures have you decided to apply in the city of Montevideo? Thank you. Yes, I am the coordinator of the Secretariat for Ethno-Racial and Migrant Populations. The idea is to recognize these different populations, particularly the intersections between the population of African descent and the indigenous populations. The idea is to fight poverty from a structural point of view. There's a lot of background noise here. Difficult to understand. We try to prioritize structural poverty, which will take into account other vulnerabilities and variables. Then territorial segregation, which applies to these populations. It's not that there are population of African descent in a new territory, but in the city, what we see is that they live in parts of the city where public services are weaker and not so accessible, more in the periphery of the city. The sound is not too good. The policies to be adopted have to include mobility within the country. Montevideo is our capital city, and the better part of the population lives there. Uruguay has 3.5 million inhabitants, and 2 million of us live in Montevideo. So it is not a huge city, but it has its specific characteristics. And when we talk about mobility, you have to think of the people who will move from the country to Montevideo, and they are particularly vulnerable as well. Different policies have been implemented, research has been carried out. We have tried to establish a diagnosis of the situation. We have analyzed religious intolerance. We have analyzed the labor situation since 2014. We have an affirmative action for the insertion of minority representatives as public officials. But educational texts have to be revised as well to try and point out which the contribution of the population of African descent in Uruguay has done for the country and its contribution to the country in the past. So a lot has been done, but there's something I wanted to point out as I was listening to Maria Elisa Velasquez. Intersectionality. There is the Coalition of Cities to Fight Racism, and in 2018, we have set up an intersectional plan with which we try to give better living conditions to LGBT groups or population of African descent or the migrant population. And we've worked with other cities, Quito, Mexico City. It's clearly a challenge of present perspectives and how to approach intersectionality when applying public policy. There shouldn't be made a difference between a woman of African descent or a migrant. But in fact, when it comes to enjoying certain rights or services, the difference becomes very clear. So cities and institutions have to realize that. And ever since 2018, we have been trying to inform our staff so that they take this into account and become aware of the vulnerabilities. Because if we have a law on affirmative action, as we do, very often we're faced with resistance because affirmative action is not understood and vulnerabilities neither, or structural disadvantages in which these population groups live. So we did all sorts of different actions, and in the Coalition of Cities to Fight Racism, Montevideo is the leading city. So we have furthered this intersectional plan, and this was our platform, which would allow us to work together and make known best practices and work in a complementary fashion with other cities. The strategy is also to take the ethnic and racial dimension and apply it at a territorial level on within a 5-year plan. And one of the main tools was the mapping, a virtual map, which is on the website, where we show different territories where we have our contact people, our organizations, which live in a community of African descent and are resilient against all the difficulties that they're faced with. And then we also have a line of work where we show in which parts of the cities citizens can really make their contributions and enjoy their rights. Maybe this should be all for the moment. Unfortunately, the sound is very bad for the speaker. Thank you very much, Maria Elisa. We'll now give the floor to Carla Moore, because there's a question addressed to her, which is this. ¿De qué manera la educación
I'm sorry, I was listening to the English channel, so I didn't hear what you said. Can you repeat it, please, Jambel?
Yes, of course. Don't worry about it. How can quality early childhood education address the low self-esteem of communities of color?
It's a great question. I think that quality early childhood education is quite significant here because early childhood education around things like compassion, empathy, self-esteem, understanding the value of self has been proven to be effective. So I think that. My concerns are that, like anything else, the disparity in funding of different schools might impact this. So case in point, the schools that are likely to have teachers available who are able to take this on, who are likely to have teachers who are equipped, who are able to take this on, who are likely to have teachers who are available and equipped and are not already stretched to the limit to take this on. It's actually those schools where the kids are likely to already have high self-esteem. When you start talking about the schools that are in the rural areas, when you start talking about the schools that are in the low income areas, in those schools, the teachers, might be really deeply entrenched in that mindset that causes a low self-esteem. And so the work we'll have to do, first of all, is to unsettle that mindset in the teachers, but then the funding might become a barrier. So I think that early childhood education is useful. I think the early childhood education would have to be coupled with work in the community, because if you tell a child one thing and then they go home and everybody around them believes another thing, you might not get that much traction. So early childhood education, yes, coupled with interventions with the parents. And I think, for the rest of my answers, it might come out, I believe in community level interventions. I believe in working at the level of the community. I think it has proven effective. And I think especially when you're dealing with children, you have to work with the community that's around them. Thanks.
Muchísimas gracias, querida Carla.
Thank you so much, dear Carla. There's another question addressed to you. Young people know about social movements against racism and discrimination, but really they are part and parcel of decision making. What can they do about it? How can they change this?
So we've asked a question about who gets to sit at the table. I think that one way that we can get young people more involved is to go to them. I think young people may not want to be associated with an organization that is significantly older than them or their parents, nor will they want to be involved in an organization that seems like you have to be very respectable to have a seat at the table. Do I have to wear a business suit? Do I have to speak perfect English or flawless Spanish? Who do I have to be to get a seat at a table that is created by UNESCO or funded by UNESCO? Young people are having conversations where they are. So I think it becomes our responsibility to actually go to them. And when we go to them, it's also about not requiring that they talk to us in language that we think is acceptable. So we have to release our ideas about respectability. We have to stop centering ourselves as adults and our ways of doing things as somehow tried, tested, and proven, and actually make space for young people to talk to us in the way that they talk, using the language that they use, and giving ideas that they think are useful. I think also when we're talking about who gets a seat at the table, we need to think about what qualifications you need to get to that table, right? Do you need a bachelor's, a master's, a PhD? How many years of work experience do you need before you can get to that table? Because a lot of times the people who get a seat at the table, they get that seat because of their jobs. But the qualifications that you need to get that job are so high that no young person has that. You literally got to be in school for 30 years to get the qualifications to get that job. Right? One of the other things that we need to think about is just give young people their own table, right? And this is where it comes back to the community. If they're already talking to each other, then how do we get a member of their group to facilitate a discussion to allow them to talk to each other about their own issues, and then we do something with that? And again, before any of this happens, it's about building the self-esteem of young people to even speak. And I say this as somebody who sometimes in Jamaica, and you go into the rural areas and a white person comes into the school, all of the children stop and they just stare at the white person. But not only do they just stare at them, they can't speak. They start stuttering because, oh my God, it's the fabled white person who has finally come down to my level. And they don't know. So how are they ever going to come into a room and speak to us? Then they're frightened. Right? So it's to build the self-esteem of them to understand that what they say has value. And a part of teaching people that what they say has value is allowing them to say it in the way that they do, which in the case in point in the Caribbean countries, what is the Creole? What is the dialect? What is the language of the people of that country? Can we get somebody to communicate with them in that language instead of asking people to learn English to communicate with us? Because that's the other thing, right? A lot of times, like in Jamaica, we speak patois. We assume that, oh, you know, it's just broken English, so talk to them in English and they're going to get it. It's a whole separate language. So get people who are bilingual and know the mother tongue of the country and English to go in and get the information in that way. And then finally, another way that I think we can empower young people of a country, and this overlaps with something else, is who are we paying to do research? Who are we paying to do research? What university are we commissioning to do the research? Who are we giving funding so that they can stop working that 9 to 8, 9 to 7, 9 to 12 job so that they can go and function, you know, focus on their work? What are we doing with the universities to empower the young people there to do research on their communities? There's an extractive relationship between Global North universities and Global South communities, where people from Global North universities come, they do research on the communities in the Global South, they get their PhD and they go. There are brilliant thinkers in the Global South, but they just don't have the money to work on the PhD or even to make it to the universities. So how are we bringing in schools as places where young people are located, and how are we funding that in a way to allow young people to talk to each other about themselves, and for that to get the backative of a PhD behind it so that it can float out into space and all these credentials? Because we love credentials and we have to be honest with ourselves.
Very good indeed. Thank you so much. Can I remind speakers, please, to answer a bit more briefly because we're short of time and we still have plenty of other questions coming in through the chat. Cindy Mesa will now have the floor. May I ask, which are your priorities in the region to fight racism and discrimination?
Thank you very much. I will base my answer in a couple of examples and explaining the work we do at the Ford Foundation. In the Andean region, we have focused mainly in people of African descent and indigenous peoples. This is one of the poorest regions in the world, and these groups have been denied political rights, making them more vulnerable to violence. In countries as Colombia and Peru, ethnic territories are places where many inequalities are taking place. Increasing inequality in ethnic territories, what Aurora Vergara Figueroa mentioned, bodies and territories that are emptied. To understand the configuration of these territories where colonization, exploitation, violence, migrations, resistance for freedom coexist with underdevelopment narrative and oppression. Our work here aims at empowering marginalized groups, and also we try to give them a bigger voice, a louder voice in different fora. Let me give you some examples. We have a project, Vision Afro 2025. Miriam Maria Elisa Velázquez talk about the decade, and we have this example from the civil society that I believe is quite telling on how international treaty agreements and rules are being put into place at a regional or local level. In 2018, we launched this initiative. As I mentioned, the name is Acción Afro 2025, to reinforce multicultural dialogue, North-South dialogues, through an intersectional platform with the Institute for Legal Studies, focus on the Global South, Afro Studies Institute from Harvard, focus in Latin America, and the Center of Afro Diaspora Studies from Cali, CEAF, that is basically focused on the African diaspora in Colombia. The main objective of this initiative is to gather international community members at a regional, local, and global level with activists and leaders from African descent and some other actors, nonprofit, etc., to establish a dialogue in order to push forward the rights of African descent communities. Starting from a basic question that Maria Elisa already mentioned, how can we make real those kind of declarations, how to move from a formal recognition of rights to a real recognition of those. In 2018, we gathered more than 400 people that work with us from the academia, NGOs, governments, international institutions. And I believe those kind of initiatives from the civil society that promotes the follow-up and monitoring of this kind of initiatives are quite valuable, and we support them from the Ford Foundation. The second example I would like to share with you is related to the Pacific Task Force. It's a group that in the COVID-19 context started its work in the Pacific region, where we have witnessed and assessed a number of discriminations and inequalities due to gender, race, etc. Those territories are also hit by a armed conflict, and many leaders have been killed just because they were defending their rights. This Pacific Task Force was born in the context of the pandemic with the help of one of our donors. And for example, I'm talking about the Diasporic Studies Center, National Council of Peace from Colombia, and others. Its work is based in 4 or 5, I would say 5 elements. For example, food security, which is crucial in the context of the pandemics, in order to analyze and understand what kind of specific needs communities have, and also to understand why basic provisions are lacking, and the importance of food security for social distancing. A second topic would be epidemiologic studies. One of the failures or the flaws in this context is that we do not have disaggregated data on this respect. So here we are taking into account different mobile solutions in order to attend to the or give an answer to the needs, the specific needs of these groups. And here I'm talking about primary health services and also to show the role of community councils. 96% of communities of African descent have a higher chance of being hospitalized by COVID-19, also to be put in RE if you compare them with non-African descent population. So there is a quite interesting work here because the strategies on rural education were not differentiated in the pandemic, and those rural communities do not have access to internet, and they don't have the devices. So education at home, it's basically impossible for them. Some of our donors, mainly the Center of African Diasporan Studies, are looking into the percentage of households that lack internet and to gather the data on those communities, and also to launch an initiative that is called Tejiendo Aprendizaje, that is focused on recovering traditional practices, putting the youth at the center of those practices. It is a network of knowledge that is based on voluntary workers that tries to provide different tools and resources for these communities that do not have internet, and for them to keep on school. We have another project, Listas para Impactar, Ready to Impact, that combines different dimensions. The intersectional approach, to begin with, is concentrated on seeing how inside a community there are specific groups that have structural weaknesses due to different reasons. One of them is, well, being a community in the Pacific in Colombia is related to gender and racist discrimination. And this project tries to combine different dimensions to have a holistic approach. One of them is the personal dimension that aims at developing a personal development plan, developing 4 areas. Have a clear purpose for leadership, self-esteem, resiliency, and how, from a cosmovision, you can protect those leader women, providing them with protection tools, self-protection tools, and collective protection tools. The idea is to develop capabilities for the different organizations. There are trainings on management, reinforcement of organizational skills of those women that are aimed to be leaders, and in the end, to transform communities, taking into account the specific dimension and the cosmovision of this community. With those examples, I just wanted to illustrate how we can apply intersectional approaches on the ground in order to deal with structural inequalities. Thank you very much, dear Cindy's. I would like to give the floor now to Dr. Rina Cáceres. And we have a question for you on the impact of racism on self-esteem for the young people in the region. How do you think UNESCO should face this challenge and contribute to change of narrative from slave as a victim to a group that contributed greatly to the construction of Costa Rica? Thank you for that question. 15 years ago, we pointed out that we had a problem of light literacy in our countries. We were underscoring what the teaching community was saying. Literacy is not only the technical skills that allows us to write and read, it's also the complex process that allows us to compare, analyze, and interpret. That is why we need specific programs. This information and the capability of interpretation is the one that builds personality, helps to develop self-esteem, or the contrary, to diminish it. And I would like to underscore that when we send our young people to school, from people from African descent and indigenous people, we teach them to be invisible. We teach them that they do not exist. Their contributions are not there, nor anywhere in the classroom with some 30 other students. This reality is also normalized. Some people are legitimate, some others are not. Some can be named, some others cannot be named. So the problem is not only for people, young people of African descent and young indigenous people. The problem is a problem from the whole society. And there is a comment here from a colleague, from a person from my country, mentioning the reality of a museum when there is no visibility of African voices. And this is something that is not only happening in Costa Rica, it's happening all over Latin America. In this respect, 15 years ago, we created a seminal group. We were 50 volunteers, I believe, that was based in creating alternative narratives with the help of Unesco, and specifically the Slave Root Project. We launched this project 15 years ago, as I said. And Maria Luisa, when she was chairing that commission, she mentioned that very many times. The very term slave root, as a term, is not reflecting what we want to reflect, because we're not talking about slaves as a thing. We're talking about that period. But in English, the thing is that you have more flexibility with words, but you don't have that with Spanish. So I remember that Maria Luisa tried to change it at an international level, but she couldn't. It's a term that I don't like, and I fighted it because it's legitimizing a very obsolete approach that we do not share. In the end, the thing is that the concept of slavery has not been deconstructed. So 15 years ago, we started working on this alternative narrative, and currently, I'm quite pleased to tell that thanks to an alliance with the Ministry of Education, we have achieved a goal. This year, this alternative narrative is included in the curriculum with pedagogical support. We'll have to wait maybe 5 or 10 years to see how it works, how it goes. And to see how this idea evolves, how in these alternative narratives, and by the way, we have the participation of African American people, indigenous people, Latin American people, all of them specialists in history. We ask for 10 years experience working in archives, and building on that, we created a project that I believe it's going to make a difference for many people. On the other hand, let me tell you that we're not doing the same with indigenous people, and there is a huge debt, historical debt, that needs to be addressed on a daily basis. And I believe that we have the challenge of building a new pedagogical system and to reset the way we think and to put the players on the stage. Thank you very much. Rina, we'll give the floor to Mateus now, and we'd like to ask him, what can we learn from social movements that could have an impact on legislation and racial justice policies? How can we keep that movement? Sorry, how are you putting the question? Is this a question for Mateus? Mateus, are you there? I believe he's not there. We'll move on now then to take some questions from the audience. There is a question for Dr. Rina Cáceres. Marino Mendoza is saying that there is a current case in his country where there is a museum on indigenous history that has just been inaugurated. And it comes with the support of the Education Ministry, but there was a problem in the inauguration because indigenous peoples could not get access to it, even though they are neighbors and they live in the area. How can we face those kind of contradictions? Yes, thank you for that question. Actually, I was trying to answer to that question before. We have a historical debt, structural debt, concerning the way we have dealt with the indigenous people issue, because it is really a marginal issue. The achievements we have reached, we have obtained concerning change of narratives in education, for example, it's not the same when we talk about indigenous peoples or people of African descent. And I believe this is a big issue. We have a big problem here when we are dealing with indigenous people. And I do not work at the Ministry of Education, but I would like to know what happened exactly. But I believe that complaints are very important, because if we do not do that, we wouldn't know what happened. But in the end, what happened there was another example of substituting experiences and taking their voice out. And we have to listen to them. We have to give them a voice. Okay, thank you very much, Rina. And next question. This is a question for all of you, for all of the participants. And they said all the presentations were very interesting. And what do you make of the looking back? I mean, the approach that in many societies is prevalent. And what is the specific situation in your population?
¿Alguno quiere responderla? Tengo en cámara.
Is there anyone perspective of intersectionality? And perhaps those would be my comments for now. Thank you. Thank you very much, Maria, for your answers. And now we've got another question from the public about the trying to include issues about race or ethnicity in the different censuses that are carried out. Some countries will use that as a way of actually making these groups more invisible in the future, to continue with discrimination against them. So what about the issue of including racial issues in census taking? Well, I think this is one of the problems that we've actually seen in recent years, that states refuse to gather that disaggregated data. I'm not a sociologist. I'm not a historian. Maria Lisa, Miriam, you could help me with that. But historically, we've seen the issue of censuses have been the foundation for redistribution of national budgeting. In my country, they say that we indigenous people have a lot of children. They say that we're underdeveloped, that we're poor because we have so many children, and yet the most recent census showed after that we had been 72% of the population, but 5 years later we came down to officially just being 30-something% of the population. So I think that this is related to what some people are calling a type of statistical elimination or murder. And after all this critique that we've seen about, for example, origin, Maya Cachiquel, language, as mother language, Cachiquel. So I think that's a step forward already. But the officials refuse to actually do that updating of that information on the ID cards, which brings us back to the issue of that they don't want to. I, though, think that it should be done. I was the one within the committee that was most fostering for that being done, the gathering of such statistical data. Thank you. May I add something to what's just been said? If there's time. Yes, please go ahead. I think the issue of statistical visibility is absolutely basic, because the question of racial self-identification, aside from being able to show what the situation is for specific populations, it also gives us the chance for that information to be used to have an influence on public policy that can make a difference. And we need to make a connection between those things. And as Jose Francisco said, in Colombia, in 2005, the population was 10 point something percent of people of African descent. In the last census, it was brought down to a lower level. And so the question is, how do we engage through that process? It doesn't have to do with the question of self-identification, but there's the entire process of how people are listed. The errors in the census taking process mean there were mistakes with the people who actually went out to gather the data. And so the number of people of African descent that was represented in the census was made smaller. So it is important that it should be included in that information, but different stages have to be carried out during that process to make sure that inclusion is actually done properly, that it really does correspond to the reality of what exists in that country. And then in terms of ethnic self-issue of narratives, and the issue of the fact that more conservative groups think that this would end up leading to specific or special rights for some people that would go, or that would somehow have a negative impact on the rights of the majority. So to give an example, these people that are in favor of self-identification have been called anti-mining groups, with a narrative of saying that recognition of specific rights of ethnic communities would work against the development of others. And so we have to be careful about that, about the importance of narratives and statistic recognition and public policies in general as well. So I would just like to leave with that. Thank you very much. And now I would like to give the floor to Maria Lisa, yes, I would like to speak a little bit about statistical visibility as well. I think it's also very important, as I was saying at the beginning of the session, that Mexican incorporated the question of self-identification for people of African descent in 2015 in the census, and now it's been also present in the most recent census of 2020. However, I think that we need to think about the question very well. How do we do it, aside from the fact that, of course, it has to go together with information and awareness raising, but also there has to a distinction that's made between racial self-identification, and countries like Mexico can concern me quite a bit, because there has to be self-identifying that has to do more with cultural processes. In Mexico, we've got people of African descent who are sometimes more white in color, or maybe less white, or so more dark. There's a great diversity. So what I'm quite concerned about feeding into race categories. I don't think that that's helpful at all, neither in a census nor in different Latin American countries. And I think that the idea of race is one which is very much present in societies such as in the United States, and it's not at all helpful in resolving racial tension. So I think we need to deconstruct that concept. And I like the idea that Francisco mentioned, that one can call oneself a Maya, or say that one is a Costa Rican of African descent, or you can make a reference to these categories, not to a race, because of course we know that races don't even exist. As I said, we continue to, we keep creating those categories over and over.
Thank you. And I give the floor to Elizabeth Suarez so that she tells me what she thinks about it. Yes, what colleagues just said, I agree fully with what Francisco said. In censorships, there should be a direct reference to funds allotted for certain policies. This is what we see in the case of Uruguay. In 2006, the ethnic variable has been implemented. That's connected with the National Statistics Institute, and it has been carried out in 2011 with the last censorship. In 2006, we amounted for 5.9% of the population, and in 2011, 8%. But these last years, households were interviewed, and apparently the population of African descent is equal to 12%. This has to do with awareness raising of specialists and the population. What questions should be asked and to whom? It's a question of dissent and of self-definition. So over and above the variables and the inclusion and the budgets, I think that in the statistical figures, the ethnic racial perspective should be included, but also a view to development for policies and for participation, because in some way or other, we have these statistical figures, but at political level, we cannot really have an influence in budgets or development policies. We are far away from the specificity of who we are. It's not just a number of figures. We need a more equitable policy, more social justice, and that should go hand in hand with other mechanisms or strategies. It shouldn't be just figures or data. In a way, better living conditions should be created, and for that, we need to strengthen civil society and participation, particularly trade union participation, more balance in participation and the right people who can fight for the budgets we need. That should be a matter of social justice. And such budgets should correspond to the proportion of the population that minority stands for. Because just the number of people, well, if no one insists on the policies to be applied, it makes no sense. Thank you, Buddy, for these answers which have enriched our discussion. Now we come to recommendations, and I would like once again to give the floor to every one of the speakers. And after that, they will have to share with us their recommendations about what to do in future. You can address these recommendations to UNESCO and the UNESCO networks. 2 minutes each, please. What could be the role of UNESCO as an international organization when fighting racism at the international level, and what you recommend for the future? Jose Francisco Cali, what would you recommend? Thank you. We have very little time, I think, but I'll try. One recommendation would be to rewrite history. Rina said that quite clearly. We have to rewrite the narrative so that we set up a new pedagogical approach. Indigenous people have to write their own history, and then the history of their state has to be redone. And the autonomy and right to free determination of indigenous people should be asserted. But first, we need a legal recognition of these people as such, and that they are equal to any other citizen. So for UNESCO, we should ask for quality education with the element of belonging to a certain group. It's not a matter of translating the same text. It is text book we need. I said disaggregated data. In these times of COVID-19, quite obviously, the need is there. It's quite clear. Indigenous people need access to healthcare, pharmacopoeias, and biological diversity, also anti-piracy.
Principalmente a los ancianos. Se pierde un anciano.
Affects mainly older people. If we lose our elders, we lose wisdom, we lose history, we lose knowledge. And the values of indigenous people can also inspire the society as a whole. I have lots of examples, but I just mentioned one of them. Urban indigenous people who later returned to their communities had even forgotten how to grow their own food. Now, during the pandemic, they have returned home and they are reacquiring this knowledge. And not only indigenous people, even the whole population is learning how to grow its own food to overcome and survive the pandemic, particularly in these terrible, difficult times, considering all the measures our states took. There's a lot to do then. And of course, indigenous people have to be recognized as such. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Cali. Cindy Mesa has the floor.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much. I agree with Jose Francisco. I just wanted to point out three things which seem important to me for what UNESCO does. How can we include different actors to follow up all the international treaties and agreements which recognize the rights of indigenous people and people of African descent? Because I think texts are one thing, but reality is different. There are different movements of indigenous people, and philanthropy has to devote itself to that. And then the narratives, which Jose Francisco mentioned. Yes, in fact, biologically speaking, I think it's established that there are no differences between the races, but it's a social construct that there are different races. And although it's metaphysical, it does have an impact, a disproportionate increment in those societies where different races exist. And not to talk about racial injustice would be wrong. And different agendas are interconnected there. The ethnic agenda and a broader racial agenda, which could integrate collective rights, lands to right, rights to land and rights to citizenship, so that these originally marginalized groups are really integrated in social economic life of a country. That was the second recommendation. I come to the third.
How to promote transnational analysis, because compared studies on racism and racial discrimination sometimes are made, organized by countries or regions, Latin America, for example, and there is a trend that makes people analyze the phenomenon in the United States as an isolated one, and they do not take into account the racial mood, the racial issue, with so many topics linked to, for example, beliefs that are being reiterated in Latin America, for example, and the North-South comparative is very interesting to understand causes and how to face structural causes of racism. This would be it, and I'll give the floor to the other speakers. Thank you, Cindy. I'll give the floor now to Madam Maria Elisa Velázquez Gutiérrez. Thank you, Jembel. 3 recommendations from me. First of all, what I already mentioned. UNESCO should have a more participatory activity in the follow-up of the declarations that come from the UN, UNESCO, for example, for the decade of recognition of people from African descent. This has to be shown in all the different projects that UNESCO has. Also, in the framework of the Slave Route project, I'd like to insist on changing the name, as Rina's already mentioned, changing the name, the meaning of many of the terms, and to push this project that was very important in giving visibility to those populations. Also, I am convinced that it is necessary to dismantle the different prejudices around ideologies on the construction of the concept of race. Populations have been racialized, and there is a problem of racism. But if we keep reproducing the concept of race, that includes not only the physical part and the things related to color, skin, but also it comprises traditions, history, virtues and defaults. When we talk about race, we are not only talking about the color of the skin. We are reproducing obsolete concepts that have been very harmful. And I believe this is very dangerous, and it's reproducing practices that should be overpassed and overcome. I invite UNESCO to do what are moderator mentioned in the beginning, to underscore the fact that these models are not working, that we need to change them, that we need to construct our narratives not on the concept of race, but on the consequences, on the impact of this concept, and also working in education for children to really do not, for children not learning those concepts from a very early age. Thank you.
Hola, ¿qué tal? ¿Me escucharon? Ahorita le
Hello.
cedemos la palabra.
I'll give the floor now to Rina Cáceres.
Profesora, tiene el micrófono apagado, no se le escucha.
Doctor, Professor, your microphone is off. We cannot hear you. Thank you. I'd like to insist on what is behind racism, narratives and pedagogical approaches. And I have 3 comments to make. First of all, as a very quick example, it's really impressive that in Latin America, we start our history and we take as a starting point of our nation's 1492, because this is excluding the civilizations that we had before. We are erasing part of our history. So from a methodological point of view, conceptual point of view, and a pedagogical perspective, we need to change our mindset. Talking about people from African descent, we have a big challenge to modify the image of the African continent, to move from the tribalized view that links the origins of people with an African ascendant to a reality that takes into account a very sophisticated history and experience of a whole continent. It's not a map of Africa focused on just one chapter. It requires a big effort from part of the educational sector to reconstruct and to redefine a narrative from the African perspective. No continent has been a part of a world campaign of invisibility as the African one. There is a very complex network of economic interests and that made the slavery, and also the different economic processes in the developed world in the second part of the 20th century. So it is shocking that in the Latin American region we have so few courses on African history. And to conclude, third idea, I believe it is quite necessary, and UNESCO is the right place to do so. As I was saying, it's quite necessary to reconstruct 2 concepts: slavery, and in this context, the slave route project can be a basis for that work, and also something that we mentioned here, the concept of race. UNESCO was pioneer in this change of mindset, and they have worked a lot on that. I work with communities, with teachers, I work in the whole Central America region, and the truth is that behind the texts used by teachers, there is the concept of ethnicity, but behind that and linked to that is the concept of ethnical superiority. And also the stratification is there. You can see that related to indigenous people and also people from African descent. So we have a huge challenge here to help our young people, young African descent people, to make schools more friendly for them. Contents as well, because what is happening on the ground is terrible. To see a girl using chlorine, putting chlorine on her skin in the bathroom in the school in order to bleach her skin is terrible. Why? Because why does she do that? Because she has to go back to her classroom and to keep listening, to keep hearing those messages saying that she does not belong to any of the contents that they're learning there. So I believe we need to review the terms, the concepts, the terminology used to analyze interculturality in our societies, because unfortunately, identities were defined in the 19th century when the elites that were, well, in the Latin American region were heirs of the colonial powers. Well, they imposed a whole model, their language, their religion, their traditions, and since this is a structural problem, we should focus on the basis that create our thought, our knowledge. And UNESCO, I believe, is the best placed institution to focus, to face this issue and changing the concept of race, the way we understand it, and every other issue related to that.
Thank you very much to you, Rina. And now we would like to give the floor to Maria Elizabeth Suarez Garcia. Above all, I would like to thank you for giving me the chance to speak. And I was able to be here on a panel that offered a lot of fascinating information. Here we're looking at history and we're looking at concepts. In Uruguay, we try to talk about slavery in Uruguay in a way, for example, where we're changing our language and no longer talking about slaves, but about enslaved people, and offer a revision of the past. I'm sorry, there's a lot of background noise and it's very difficult to hear the speaker. I would like to commend this initiative of trying to create the connection between expertise or know-how and the academic world, to be able to offer input, to offer answers to local and national governments. I'm very grateful for that and for the chance to be able to participate in this panel. Some of the issues that have been mentioned about the drafting of policies we've seen has been a bit weak sometimes in trying to come up with public policies in the United Nations, but I believe that governance to be very important, especially in the strengthening of civil society. That's absolutely basic in my opinion. UNESCO can contribute a lot in that respect. I also think that action should be done with a holistic approach, taking into account the role of the international community in this transnational issue. It's true that sometimes we see countries that are not so far away, or that seem very far away, and it has a question of impact. I think Maria Luisa was saying that sometimes we look about the United States as being so far away and different from our country, and yet those racial practices are something that we do actually see in our own country. So we have this regional perspective, this international vision, this universal vision is something that I think to be basic. because I believe it's important to emphasize that democracy is not universal nor representative if we don't take into account people and the reality that they live in, the communities themselves, or minorities in this particular case. This calls upon us to keep working on better governance and a change of structural models, which up until now, institutions that have been plagued by structural racism, institutionalized racism, one of the worst aspects of society that we need to work towards. We can't believe in a more free or more just society unless it's one that is free and just for everyone. Thank you. Thank you, Miriam. And now I'd like to give the floor to Carla Moore to hear her recommendations.
Thank you so much. So my recommendations, I think the biggest recommendation is that we have to continue to think intersectionally about how we're going to address racism. I think it's come up in all of our presentations here. I think that reclamation and empowerment of the poorest and most vulnerable people is key. A part of that involves, yes, rewriting the script that we have about Africa, rewriting the script that we have about indigenous communities. In the Caribbean, it's actually how do we grapple with Haiti, right? Which in the Caribbean is actually all representative of the African continent, and the way that we relate to Haiti is indicative of our larger issue there. So I think it is about, yes, education and using education to build self-esteem and shift the ideas that we have about African people and Black people, people of African descent. It's also about figuring out how we can do some healing work in our communities so that we can start to remedy some of these things. And I think also it's about looking to community-based activities. I think UNESCO can support public education on racism and race-based thinking in our context. So what does that look like in a majority Black country? And also, how does North American cultural imperialism continue to muddy the water and affect the work that we're trying to do? What does decolonization and anti-colonial thinking look like in 2020? I think we need to update these conversations. And then we also need to figure out what is happening in countries where the majority of people are Black, but yet this type of thing is still happening. And finally, and I don't know if this is within UNESCO's scope, but I have to say it, I think that we have to think about poverty eradication as a way of addressing these issues of racism and other types of discrimination, in particular debt forgiveness, because in countries where people are poor, then the types of violence that you're likely to experience in those countries is different. Hypermasculinity is different. Gender-based violence is different. So we say that we are serious about ending these types of discrimination and we're serious about creating equality in these countries, but then these countries are still grappling with debt that makes it difficult for them to do anything. It makes it difficult for them to devote money to education. It makes it difficult for them to open shelters for women who are living with gender-based violence. It makes it difficult for them to even contend with race because there's just no money to go around. So I think poverty eradication and having those conversations about how do we create national sovereignty, how do we minimize dependency of these, majority Black or majority indigenous countries, how do we do those things at a structural level by minimizing the interference by, people like the IMF in the policy space of these countries, that type of stuff. Because I mean, for example, in Jamaica, one of the things that I've noted is COVID-19 has impacted us significantly because we've moved largely towards a service-based economy under some of the structural readjustment programs, which means that we are dependent on tourism and business process outsourcing, which is the call centers. Tourists are not coming to Jamaica. The BPOs, anything that happens outside of Jamaica impacts our jobs here. And so unemployment is spiking in a terrifying way because we've moved to this service-based industry where largely if other people don't use our services, we cannot employ ourselves. So how do we move to poverty eradication through debt forgiveness? What is it that we need to be thinking about through the IMF? Like what does on a holistic level seeing about the advancements of communities look like will they advance on their own terms? And how do some of these international bodies interrupt the capacity for communities to do that? And, you know, what is the research that's needed to support making these types of moves? And then also diversity in everything that we do. So how is it that we include people from diverse backgrounds in all of the conversations that we're having? And how do we start at the community level? I think we are accustomed to working with particular gatekeepers in the countries that we go into, but sometimes those gatekeepers have now progressed so far up the ladder that they're very far from the grassroots. And so there's information that we're missing. So how do we work with gatekeepers, and how do we work at the community level to make sure that the information that we're getting is accurate and can tell us about the lived reality of people who are dealing with racism versus, you know, intellectually what we think it is?
Thank you very much. We're going to be, thank you very much on behalf of UNESCO. We'd like to thank all of the speakers for the conversation they've given us today and for their thoughts and recommendations. UNESCO will gather all that information. I would like to invite Ms. Ana Maria Manholt in the section of inclusion of UNESCO to give us some final closing words. Go ahead, please.
Excuse me, Jamal, I will intervene on behalf of Ana Maria, who had to leave the meeting. I would like to start by transmitting the greetings of Gabriela Ramos, who is thankful to every one of the speakers for the valuable contribution to our debate. Mrs. Ramos had to leave the meeting before the end, so she couldn't greet you herself. This was a very rich debate. It will, of course, help us a lot for the next steps to be devised in the development of the UNESCO program to intensify fight against racism and discriminations in these difficult times. We have recorded the whole discussion, so it will be very helpful to define and prioritize what we do next. As to what we're going to do, well, for once, the theoretical part, which consists in demolishing the whole idea of race and find a new definition for the concept of slave and slavery, as colleagues were saying. And then there is another dimension, which is in fact broader, to come to the operative part, to come to action and implementation. And there we have to change narratives. We want to develop a new pedagogical approach, which will include peoples of African descent and indigenous people. They have to be recognized because so far and for centuries they have been marginalized in their own countries. This is more of an international analysis. We have to follow up more systematically what international organizations like the UN are doing, also the Committee for the fight against racism, then something more systematic work within the decade, and the idea of data gathering, disaggregated data, we will have to gather, because the concept of statistic genocide was launched. So with these ideas, I'd like to thank you all, also our audience, who've stayed with us, even over and above the time originally set for this meeting. And please communicate with UNESCO during the future stages of our work. Thanks to all of you. And we continue working together. Goodbye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, till later, till soon. Thanks.
Dembel, quisiera solamente agradecerte para tu trabajo.
Jamel, thank you especially for being the moderator. Thank you for asking